Dale Hyatt. I'm a member of the Texas A&M Poultry Science Department, have been for the past 33, 34 years or so, and I've always been really involved in poultry youth programs, and many of you may recognize me as being a judge at your show. I've judged several shows throughout the state of Texas. Just to give you a few credentials in case you'd have any questions later, I'm also the superintendent of the Houston Livestock Poultry Show and Rodeo Poultry Show and San Antonio, and I'm a veteran member of the FFA Poultry Committee for the past 20 years. So what I want to do today is just give you some tips. Some of you that have already experienced with showing poultry, this may be a little bit redundant, but you may pick up something. And those of you that are going to be new showers, this hopefully will be a big help to you. We're going to talk mainly about broilers. We'll get into turkeys just a little bit. So we're going to talk about brooding and management of show poultry. Now, one thing I want to point out before we get started is, the poultry show is not an expensive show to get into, and in my opinion, probably the fairest show on the grounds. If you show within the state of Texas, you're going to get birds that were processed through our department. They'll be identified with wing bands, and everybody will have the same genetic stock. We try to get them from the same breeder flock and the same incubator even, so that it becomes a management competition and not who's got the most money to buy the best like some of the others. So with that in mind, I would encourage you to give it a try because it is a fun project. It's a short-term project, but however, it is intense. It's a very, very busy 6 weeks if you're talking broilers and up to 18 weeks if you're talking turkeys. But the key to raising competitive show poultry is housing, clean environment, fresh water, balanced nutrition diet, no experiments, get a good quality show feed, feeding programs, and effective culling and selecting. And we'll just touch on that as we go along. Bird environments dependent on a number of important factors: housing, temperature, ventilation, litter, feed and water, and cleanliness. And all those are just about of equal importance. We'll go through them step by step. Optimum housing. One thing I want to point out is you don't have to spend a whole bunch of money to house these birds correctly. It can be done relatively inexpensively. You can go the whole 9 yards, and I'll show you some examples of that too, but for the most part, it can be an inexpensive product. The animal's not that expensive, and of course, the housing doesn't have to be. But the designs vary considerably. They just have to serve a purpose. They protect the birds from adverse environmental conditions. Ventilation is crucial, of course, control of humidity, air quality, and we have to give them oxygen. Housing protects the birds from predatory animals or free-flying birds, anything that might pass disease to them or external parasites, etc. Ventilation. We got to get oxygen to these birds. It keeps the litter in good condition, reduces ammonia. If you smell ammonia when you walk into your poultry house, you don't have enough ventilation. It's pretty much period right there. Molds, fungus, temperatures throughout the pen need to be even and consistent. You want to have optimum bird comfort because you want to maximize the genetic capability of that bird, and you want to compete with your buddy down the road, and to do that, you've got to have everything really perfectly in line. Brood heat. Now, when you get these chicks, your ag leader or your youth poultry leader is going to deliver them to you after they've been picked up from our facility for wing banding, etc. They're going to have just come out of a 100-degree incubator, and they're not ready for room temperature. Generally, the rule of thumb is you start out with a litter temperature somewhere around 88 degrees. I wouldn't worry too much about the thermometer. You really watch the birds and make sure they're comfortable. And then as they get older, and depending on the time of year that you're rearing your birds, you want to keep them comfortable. If they're panting, they're not eating, and that means they're hot. And if they're huddling, they're cold and they're not eating. And anytime they're not eating, you're losing ground. That's what I mean by an intense, vigorous project. Your buddy down the road, he may have his eating all the time. They'll gain a little more weight, and you're liable to fall behind. Air conditioning, some people choose to use air conditioning, and that's okay. My recommendations for that is make sure you have enough capacity to keep the air change out in that particular pen so that we don't get ammonia built up and et cetera and so on. And also, you got to acclimate those birds before you take them to the showgrounds. Most of your shows are not going to be in an air-conditioned environment. And these birds have been used to air conditioning. You introduce them suddenly to intense heat, you can lose them. A lot of times when you walk through the showgrounds and you see the expired broilers in the pens, a lot of those people were the air-conditioned birds. They're big old birds, but a few days before the show, you want to start bringing them up to temperature and get them acclimated to what they're going to experience at the showgrounds. The first evidence of appropriate temperature is behavior of the birds. And as far as I'm concerned, you don't have to own a thermometer. If they're huddling, they're cold. If they're panting, they're hot. And bottom line is they're not eating. Housing types and designs, you don't have to spend big money, like I said before. It doesn't have to be a permanent structure. I helped my nephew build a collapsible pen that they raised every year in the garage, and it hung on the wall. There's some creative ways to do it. All you have to do is make sure you're taking care of the needs of those birds. The housing, the way it looks or what it costs is really not a factor. Now here's a pen inside of a garage. This was in College Station, Texas here. I took this picture. You can see it's very inexpensive lumber used to construct it, cheap chicken wire, and this will do fine. This particular pen of birds here actually won the Houston Livestock Show in 1989. Turkeys, they need a little bit more room. We'll talk about floor space here in a bit. But again, it doesn't have to be expensive, and it may be a structure that you've utilized for other things that you can shut down and use for your show birds once a year during the grow-out period. Now, you'll have different opportunities or different options, if you will, for waterers. These are the automatic jug type or bell type drinkers, Plasons actually. They work fine, but remember they have to be cleaned daily, just like a regular jug fountain. So don't think because they're automatic that they don't need to be cleaned. A bird will eat as much as fresh water that it drinks. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you have nasty water there, they'll drink just enough to stay alive. That means they'll eat just enough to stay alive, and you're not going to do well at the show. So make sure it's clean, fresh water. These bell fountains tend to take a very low pressure, so make sure you read the directions when you install them. Now here's, like I said, you can go the whole 9 yards and build fancy houses if you want to, but it's absolutely really not necessary. And there's an example of some people that did very well, but they took a horse barn and cleaned the cage pen out and put birds in there once a year, and it worked out well for them. Here's just a really quick made pen attached to the outside of the house. Nothing wrong with this pen with one exception. Be careful where you locate it. You see the condensing unit to their air conditioning system there, and that's going to be dumping heat into that pen. Again, air conditioning, just remember the cautions I told you earlier. A lot of people will air condition like Morgan buildings or small storage buildings or their pen. And if you happen to be rearing birds during the hot times of the summer, I know the Grimes County show, the Crosby show, there's a few of them out there. You can do real well with it, but make sure you have enough capacity to keep the air change out in that pen, and also make sure that you acclimate them before you take them to the showgrounds. Now be ready before your birds come. You're going to know when they're going to be delivered by your youth leader. Have your brooder lamps already turned on. You don't want to set them down on cold shavings. And it also warms up the feed and the water. That makes the water more tepid, and because, again, they're used to a 100-degree environment, and they're not ready for ice water. Type and numbers of feeders, there's a lot of various options there. It's hard to beat that tube feeder. It usually holds about 30 pounds of feed, and they work well, but if you want to use trough feeders, that's fine too. A lot of people like to put the rain gutters along the perimeter of the pen because it doesn't take up a lot of floor space, and it gives them more area to eat. Make sure you have plenty of feed available. If you got an area that's lacking feeders and waters, especially with turkeys, they'll get out there, and if they don't see them, they'll forget to eat. And the whole key to winning this contest, or this exhibition, if you will, is who can get the most feed down the neck of that bird. And that's done with lots of clean, fresh water and plenty of feed available. Again, like I said, the hanging tube type feeders, they're really hard to beat. You can actually make them out of 5-gallon buckets if you wish. And then a little more perimeter feeders along the walls where it's not taking up floor space, gutter material, modified PVC, etc. Can't hurt. The more feed you put out there, the better off you're going to be. Again, I talked about the bell-type waters. You'll have to set them very low if you use them to start them. I recommend you getting those very inexpensive 1-gallon jug waters. They take constant filling. However, that means you're getting a lot of fresh, clean water to them. Just never let them run empty. Never let them go without water. Fresh, clean water must be continually available at all times. Remember, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio as far as feed intake, and feed intake is what we're after. Waters must be clean, must be fresh. You should almost be willing to drink out of them yourself. Don't do it, but close to it. Rinse the waters daily, scrub them. You don't want to get any microbial growth, etc. Some people like to use brooder rings, if you will. They're basically referred to as draft rings, and they're designed to keep the drafts off the birds. More than likely, you're not going to have to deal with that in your pen. But I want you to look at the adjustment of the feeders and waterers here. That would be the correct adjustment if you were feeding and watering broilers for the industry. They're looking at feed conversions. They're looking at making a profit. I'd like to see those feeders and waterers lower so that they can eat lazily while they're laying down and don't have to stretch for it. We may waste a little feed, but Mom and Dad got plenty of money to buy your feed. We're going to win this show. Remember, even if you go with the larger jug-type fountains, this happens to be a 3-gallon fountain right here, just because they'll hold a week's worth of water, don't let them sit that long. Wash them daily. Refill them. When you first get your chicks, now we've got everything warmed up. We've had the brood lamps put on them, and the litter's warm, the water's warm, even the feed's warm. We're going to start a few of them drinking by dipping their beaks in the water. They're thirsty. They have got to rehydrate before they start eating. It may be 3 days since they were hatched before you get them into your pen. We'll go pick them up from a commercial hatchery, bring them back to the A&M Poultry Research Center. Then we'll have a crew come in and band them. And the next day at the soonest is when your ag leaders will pick them up. So they've got to drink so they can start eating. We always start them out with a little bit of feed on the floor like you see in that pie plate right there. And that's to stimulate them to eat. Instinctively, they look at their feet to start eating, because in the wild, that wild Java jungle fowl or the wild turkey poult, the mother scratches up feed on the forest floor, what have you, and that's where they look to it at first. Once they learn that this green stuff that's crumbled up tastes pretty good and they need it, they'll see it over there in that tube feeder, and you notice we have the tube feeder in place also. And about 2 or 3 days, we start getting a lot of manure, and that plate gets nasty, we can throw it away. It's served its purpose. Again, the brooder ring may or may not be necessary in your situation. Really serves 2 purposes: keeps drafts off the birds, and it corrals them around the feeders and waters and heat until they learn what it is. So now we've trained them over. Now they're eating out of the feeders. Everything, we're off and running. We'll start adjusting the feeders as they grow, but we're going to keep them somewhat lower than we would if it was an industry situation. Keep them at a happy medium to where we're not getting a lot of litter and manure in the feed, but yet they don't have to go to big extremes to reach to eat. Okay, what's the problem here? These birds are too cold. I don't need a thermometer to tell me that. They're huddled up. They're trying to conserve all the warmth they have. You have got to get more heat in there in this situation, because bottom line, they're not eating. And remember, whoever gets the most feed down the neck of that bird are going to be the potential winners. These birds are too hot. There's a couple of them eating, but you see they can't get under the light. It's like a donut. And if you look close, I don't know if you can see it in this shot, but they're panting. If they're panting, they're not eating. Litter. There's a lot of choices you can find for litter at your local feed store. Rice hulls, peanut hulls, etc. It's really hard to beat good pine wood shavings. The purpose of the litter is to protect the birds from any skeletal or carcass deformities and to pump water out of the house. And you know that the major shows, first you go through a sift. And that's to make sure that this bird qualifies for a grade A carcass. And if you have defects, breast blisters, etc., from poor litter conditions, you can be sent home without even, and that means 6 weeks for nothing of raising these birds. Breaks my heart every time I see it, and you don't want that to happen. The litter doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be fresh. You don't have to clean it, change it out all the time, but it needs to be tilled or stirred to keep the moisture out of it, to keep it somewhat dry, fluffy, and resilient, if you will. Floor space. The more the merrier for the most part, but here are some minimums for you as far as broilers, roasters, and turkeys are concerned. Like to give them more if you got it, if you got the space. Now, you can start out with a whole bunch of chicks knowing that you're going to cull them as time goes on to give them that extra space. And I do recommend getting as many chicks as you can within reason that's affordable to you, because it's a numbers game also. There's a little genetic lotto in this, and so the more lottery tickets you buy, the better your chances. The more birds you have, the better chance of getting those genetic outliers that might win the show. But remember, keeping in mind that as we get towards showtime, we're going to be pulling birds out of there through real intensive culling to give them lots of space. Now, if you give them an acre in a shade tree, that's fine, but make sure you're filling that area with feeders and waterers. Remember, again, they have to see them. In the industry, there's a rule of thumb: they shouldn't walk any more than 5 feet without hitting a feeder or waterer. That's just a basic rule of thumb. Common sense will get you by on that. Broilers, we're going to give them continuous lighting. We may dim the lights a little bit after a couple weeks because we don't want them to be too active. We can get into congestive heart problems because we're feeding these birds so intensely that they are getting pretty good size for the cardiovascular system they have to handle their system. With turkeys, if you have hens, you get to about 8 to 10 weeks, you're going to have to start backing your lights off. You're going to have to get a timer and take 15 minutes a week or so off, so they'll stimulate not to go into production, because turkeys at 18 weeks can actually start production, and we don't want them laying eggs because that means we've got feed that's going to reproduction instead of putting meat on that bird so I can win the show. We used to recommend exercising the birds to firm them up. No longer. The genetics of these birds now, they are so huge, so obese, that it's just like if you're 11 years old and weigh 400 pounds, you don't want to go running laps until you lose some weight. Same principle here. Get them up to eat. That's a big key. And the people that win are the ones that go in and out of the pen all the time and just barely nudge them to get up and eat. But exercise, that's out of the question. So here we go, the 10 basic essentials of management. Adequate floor space, after culling, of course. Feed a good high-quality show feed with adequate feeder space. And when I say show feed, make sure you do buy a show feed. There's several brands out there: Purina, Co-op, Full of Pep, Acco. They're all pretty good feeds. These people want your business. They want to see you win also. But don't buy some leftover feed that Grandpa had from feeding his laying hens or something like that, or you're going to be in big trouble. Always keep them temperature. Watch the birds. Keep them comfortable. If they're panting, they're not eating. If they're piling, they're not eating. Provide plenty of ventilation, and they love that open side cross ventilation when they get full feathered and can handle it. But if you walk in your pen and there's a strong ammonia level, you're not ventilating enough. And keep your litter tilled and resilient so that you don't develop blisters or skeletal deformities that'll get you sifted before you even show. Walk among the birds as often as possible, and I can't stress that one enough. When you come home from school or work and you go to your pen, the birds are usually going to be sitting down, almost sleeping. When they see you and they get up, first thing they do is say, well, let's go eat and drink. The people that win shows are in and out of that pen frequently, all the time. That's probably one of the biggest points I want to make as far as all of this. Provide adequate lighting. They got to see to eat. Cull deliberately. If that bird is scrawny or crippled at any time during the grow-out period, it's not going to go to the show and it's not going to win. And that pretty well sums it all up. Just some basic facts for you to be competitive on those showgrounds. Good luck, and I hope you win it all.